They were supposed to be watching the sunset from their cockpit, maybe with a glass of wine, maybe with music playing low. That's the life they'd built, quiet, free, and full of saltwater horizons. But instead, somewhere between Grenada and St. Vincent, Ralph Hendry and Kathy Brandel vanished. At 66 and 71 years old, Ralph and Kathy were living the dream many only talk about. They'd traded land life for open water, choosing a liveaboard lifestyle on their beloved Catamaran simplicity. They weren't just sailing, they were thriving. Longtime members of the Salty Dog Sailing Association, they had years of experience and were known for their kindness, calm confidence, and easy smiles. To those in the cruising world, they weren't strangers. They were neighbors, dockmates, and friends. But in February 2024, the story of Ralph and Kathy took a turn no one saw coming. A nightmare that began quietly and ended with a community in mourning. A family searching for answers and a boat found drifting, soaked in silence and blood. Ralph and Kathy weren't weekend sailors. They weren't out on a sabbatical or some late-life experiment. This was their life. They had embraced the rhythms of the sea full-time, sailing from island to island, soaking in the quiet beauty of the water, sharing stories with fellow cruisers, and always guided by the tides and the wind. Their boat simplicity wasn't just a vessel, it was home. A sturdy catamaran built for long passages and comfortable living, she had carried them safely across thousands of miles. They weren't in search of luxury, they were in search of peace, and for years, they had found it. On February 19, 2024, 3 prisoners broke out of the South St. George Police Station in Grenada. Their names were Ron Mitchell, Trevon Robertson, and Atiba Stanislaus. All 3 had violent charges pending: armed robbery, assault, and more. Their escape triggered an island-wide manhunt, but they didn't stay on land for long. Investigators now believe the men made their way to the coastline and targeted Simplicity, still anchored quietly with Ralph and Kathy aboard. It's unclear whether the couple was overpowered immediately or if they tried to resist. What happened during those early hours on the boat remains a dark mystery. Days later, Simplicity was found drifting off the coast of St. Vincent. She was empty. Her sails were in disarray. The navigation system had been tampered with, the galley was torn apart, and most chilling of all, there were visible signs of violence and blood inside the cabin. There was no sign of Ralph or Kathy. The U.S. consulate in Barbados contacted their sons, Nick Burrow and Brian Hendry, the kind of call no one is ever ready for. Their parents were missing. Their boat had been recovered, and the early signs were grim. The news spread quickly through the cruising community. Ralph and Kathy were well known, not just for their experience, but for their warmth and presence. The Salty Dog Sailing Association released a statement confirming the hijacking and urging caution for others in the region. Sailors are used to handling storms, but this was different. This was personal. Many had shared anchorages with the couple, shared meals, even traded spare parts or weather tips. The thought that something so violent could happen to such seasoned and well-loved sailors sent a wave of sorrow and fear across the region. 3 days after Simplicity was found, the escaped prisoners were captured in St. Vincent. They had apparently tried to blend in, but were quickly identified and arrested. Local authorities began piecing together the timeline, working with Grenadian officials and U.S. investigators to uncover the full story. But Ralph and Kathy were still missing, and the men in custody weren't talking. Nick and Brian held on to hope. As grim as the evidence was, there was no confirmation, no bodies, no eyewitnesses. Maybe they had escaped. Maybe they'd been forced off the boat and found safety. Maybe, somehow, they were alive. But as the hours turned into days and the silence stretched unbearably long, even hope started to feel heavy. The family launched a campaign to raise awareness and support while quietly preparing themselves for the worst. For sailors across the Caribbean and beyond, this wasn't just a tragic headline, it was a gut punch, a moment of shared vulnerability. Ralph and Kathy weren't reckless. They weren't pushing the limits. They were anchored in a well-known spot on a well-maintained boat, doing exactly what thousands of others do every day, and yet they were targeted, or at the very least caught in a storm of violence they didn't invite and couldn't have predicted. It forced every cruiser to ask the question, am I really safe out here? The romance of sailing is often painted in watercolor: sunsets, dolphins, fresh fish on the grill, but seasoned sailors know there's another side. Storms don't always come from the sky. Sometimes they come from shore. Remote anchorages, beautiful and serene, can also be isolated and lawless. In some parts of the world, police response times are slow or non-existent. Cell service can vanish the moment you leave a marina. Nighttime becomes a roll of the dice. And while most locals in cruising areas are kind and helpful, desperation can turn even a harmless port into a place of danger. Sailing couples couples, especially older ones, face unique risks. They often travel alone, with no crew to watch the cockpit while someone sleeps. If attackers come by dinghy at night, there may be no warning. Even with VHF radios and flares, help can be miles away, and most sailors know that once someone's on board uninvited, the odds shift fast and hard. The story of Simplicity wasn't just a tragic one. It shattered a sense of calm that many had taken for granted. It sparked quiet conversations on docks and louder ones online. Sailors began to revisit their security setups: motion alarms, deck lights, self-defense tools, emergency plans. Cruising forums buzzed with shared advice: how to lock hatches at night, how to rig lines that alert you to movement, how to coordinate buddy boats for safety in numbers. But beyond the fear, there was something else, a wave of solidarity. The sailing community, while scattered across oceans, is tightly woven. In the days after the news broke, sailors raised flags in honor of Ralph and Kathy. Dinghy memorials were held in small harbors. GoFundMe campaigns were set up to support the family. Emails, messages, and radio calls echoed their names. In every anchorage, people remembered them, not just for how they were lost, but for how they lived. Many sailors responded not by shrinking back from the sea, but by honoring the Hendrys through vigilance, kindness, and deeper connection with one another. Some made pacts to sail in pairs. Others began checking on nearby boats more often, making sure every cruiser felt seen and safe. What emerged wasn't panic, it was purpose. Because while this life carries risk, it also carries something else: community. A belief that even in the face of darkness, the spirit of the sea isn't just about freedom, it's about looking out for each other, about raising a hand when someone is in trouble, and about never forgetting those who fell along the way. For Ralph and Kathy, their story is now part of the hard truth that lives below the surface of every perfect anchorage. But it's also part of the strength that binds sailors together, and that, perhaps, is their final gift. Why Simplicity? Was it random or targeted? And what happened in those terrifying hours between the hijacking and the boat's recovery? Did Ralph and Kathy resist? Were they forced overboard? Murdered at anchor? The truth remains agonizingly out of reach, but pieces of the puzzle and possible scenarios are beginning to emerge, even if they are steeped in speculation. Authorities have not confirmed if Simplicity was chosen at random, but based on its location, anchored not far from shore in a semi-secluded area, it may have simply been the most accessible and least protected vessel in the vicinity when the prisoners were desperate to escape the island. Catamarans are particularly attractive to criminals because of their size, speed, and ease of handling compared to larger monohulls. If the escapees had been watching the harbor beforehand, they may have chosen Simplicity for its lack of crew beyond the couple. One likely hypothesis is that the prisoners approached under cover of darkness, perhaps using a stolen dinghy or even swimming from shore. If Ralph and Kathy were on board and awake, it's plausible they were overpowered quickly, caught off guard by intruders they weren't prepared to defend against. Even seasoned sailors are vulnerable when their home is invaded suddenly at night. A single slip or delay in judgment can become fatal when you're outnumbered and isolated. Another scenario is that the couple was already asleep when the escapees boarded. In that case, the hijackers may have subdued them in their cabin, possibly tying them up or threatening them with weapons. It's possible that Ralph and Kathy were kept alive for a period, maybe even forced to sail the boat under duress. This could explain why the sails were partially set and navigation systems tampered with. If the escapees lacked sailing experience, they may have relied on Ralph to operate the vessel at first, only to later dispose of both him and Kathy once they no longer needed them. A more disturbing theory suggests the violence was immediate and fatal. The blood found inside the cabin and galley indicates a struggle occurred aboard. Did Ralph try to defend Kathy? Was there a fight? A desperate attempt to resist? If one or both were injured in the process, the attackers might have panicked, throwing the couple overboard, alive or otherwise, to eliminate witnesses and take full control of the vessel. Then there's the possibility that the couple was led onto the deck or forced into the water at gunpoint. Maybe they were made to abandon ship in their own dinghy or pushed overboard while under sail. The lack of bodies suggests they weren't killed and hidden aboard, but lost to the sea. If they were alive when forced into the water, they may have tried to swim or drift to shore. But in open ocean conditions, without flotation or light, survival would be slim. Adding to the complexity is what investigators haven't shared: whether weapons were recovered, whether any electronics like GPS trackers or radios were tampered with, or if any belongings of Ralph and Kathy were missing, suggesting robbery as a partial motive. Did the escapees intend to keep the boat and live aboard it? Or were they simply desperate to flee and saw simplicity as a vehicle of escape? What is clear is that the suspects made little effort to clean up the scene. Blood was left in plain view, sails were sloppy, systems were left half-engaged. It hints at chaos, panic, or inexperience, suggesting the crime may have spiraled beyond even what the attackers intended. To date, the suspects have revealed little during interrogation. There's been no public confession, no detailed recounting of events. Whether from legal strategy or lack of remorse, their silence leaves a cruel vacuum where truth should be. Without direct statements or recovered remains, law enforcement can only reconstruct a timeline based on physical evidence and maritime logic. In the end, we are left with tragic questions and theories, each one painful, each one incomplete. For their sons, Nick and Brian, for the sailing community that loved them, and for every cruiser who's ever spent a night at anchor thinking they were safe, that unknown weighs heavily. And with every passing day, as memories fade and the ocean holds its silence, the reality becomes harder to bear. Ralph Hendry and Kathy Brandel weren't lost at sea in the way sailors sometimes are. They were taken, ripped from their dream life by an act of human violence that left no room for peace. But their story is more than the way it ended. It's in the way they lived, with quiet strength, deep joy, and a love for the sea that was honest and enduring. They will be remembered not just for the tragedy that found them, but for the freedom they chose, the community they cherished, and the gentle courage they carried into every anchorage. Fair winds, Ralph and Kathy.